Welcome to the Better Student Ministry Podcast, where we take a deep dive into practical youth ministry topics to help you and your team become better at what God has called you to do. We're joined now by your hosts, Mark and Jared, who together have over 30 years of youth ministry experience.
Hey everybody, welcome back, or welcome to Better Student Ministry Podcast. My name's Jared.
And my name is Mark. Thanks so much for taking the next 25 to 30 minutes of your life. And
could be 35, could be 40.
That's true.
Well, they've already seen how long it is because they can see it. But
if they play this on 0.5 speed, it could
Wow.
be an hour of
Yeah.
me sounding like...
play it on double speed and
Yeah.
you'll really have some fun. But nevertheless, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're listening, and we're excited. We've got a great topic today that is vitally important, and we're both pretty passionate about this, so I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of those areas. I feel like every episode I start by saying this is one of these areas that were really important to our youth ministry, and I wish I did better. And now all
Me
this
too.
podcast has done is made me regret so many decisions in my youth ministry.
I was a terrible youth pastor. What am I doing? Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm with you.
I think we find more often than not God grows things in spite of us instead of because of us.
That's true.
So that's free. That's free today on this
But
podcast.
nevertheless, we can learn and grow, which is why we're grateful you're listening to this podcast.
Boom.
Learn from us old dudes. There's a lot of wisdom in this group, mostly from me, but also Mark has a little bit to share. So
Thank you for recognizing my contribution.
well, today we want to talk to you guys about creating great small groups. And before we dive into some details and some things we've learned, it's important to note youth ministry is about making disciples. At the end of the day, that's what it is, or at least that's what it should be. And I'm pretty convinced that making disciples is impossible without small groups. It's the model we see in Jesus, right? He used several different environments, but one of the primary one was small groups. He had disciples who were living and learning together in a small group and interacting with each other and interacting with him. And so it's certainly a biblical model, but it's also an important model to help students become disciples of Christ. And so if we're serious about the mission of God, I would argue we need to be serious about small groups.
Yeah, I think there's so much about being a follower of Christ where the rubber meets the road between the theology and the knowledge I have, and then the praxology of what is it that I'm doing and what does it look like to live out my life like that.
Did you find, though, like in your experience with youth ministry, isn't it tempting to be more concerned with the service than something like small groups? Like it's easier to put more energy, you validate your youth ministry based on who attends on a service, than small groups can oftentimes kind of feel like an afterthought.
Sure, and I think unfortunately that's only compounded by the fact that for the typical personality of the youth pastor or youth leader, the big group environment is an energizing, hey, I'm in front of everybody, I'm leading the group, we're doing some crazy, wacky things, we're talking.
I've worked hard on my sermon,
yeah,
and I'm convinced it's the greatest thing that will ever be delivered to humankind.
Sure, I think it's just more of that performance lifestyle, which the typical extroverted youth leader thrives in. Whereas with small groups, it's intentional, it's quieter, it's more focused, and quite honestly, you've got to be prepared almost even more so in a small group environment than you do in the, hey, you all listen to me talk, versus let's have a conversation together.
Yeah. So let's start the conversation a little bit. By the way, if you're new to the Better Student Ministry Podcast, we also create training videos that are about 10 minutes long for you and your team to watch, accompanied by some small group questions for you to discuss how do you get better in this area in your context. And we talk about some things in that video that we're going to get into, but before we do, I want to pivot a little bit and land in an area that I think is important when we're talking about small groups. And this is, I want to hit on some of the essential things that make a great small group. And you and I were talking about this before we started recording, and we really came down to one of the main things is it comes down to leadership. Like leadership is, I would say, the most important thing when it comes to creating a great small group. It's not the content, although content matters, and we may spend some time hitting on that. At the end of the day, it's who is that leader. And in your experience, Mark, what have you found are some of the most important things when it comes to having a great leader leading a small group?
Well, I would say if it is at all possible, having more than one adult leader overseeing that small group is going to be a benefit to the group at large. It's going to be a benefit to that leader as well. So I would say as much as possible, try to leverage at least a team, a two-person team leading together. I tend to find that by having another set of ears, they're also able to hear something that one person doesn't hear by themselves, and they're able to support one another, work off of one another, encouraging each other. Not to mention, in general, it's just better doing things together. So a lot of times, it's also a great training ground for more leaders. Hey, come and watch me as I lead, and then that multiplication process continues to unfold. Then as they're ready to be released and doing some of their own leadership stuff as well. But I think one of the things that you may also be referring to is the success of that small group meeting a lot of times hinges on the leader's ability to manage the group, the leader's ability to understand what the focus and tension of the group is. And sometimes if we're just topically focused, we miss the life care opportunities, we miss the discipleship opportunities. And if we're so worried about, I got to get through these 5 questions, and we miss what might be 2 or 3 other questions that's just going on in their life, we've missed a bigger opportunity to point them to Christ and see their life transformed and shaped and changed. And so by seeing how small groups functions in the larger discipleship process for your youth ministry as that key leader, it's not just so we got to get through these questions. It's it's seeing how it fits into taking this student from a come and see who Jesus is, and then want to be a follower of Jesus, and then want to see other people meet Christ, and where that small group comes into play.
And I think small groups are even like a large group service is a lot of your content happens there. Like if you're preaching or sharing, but a small group setting is less about content, although it matters, but it's so much about relationship.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, one of the key differences, if not the key difference, between a great small group and a terrible small group is, do the people in the small group have a relationship with the small group leader? And if the answer is no, then it may be fine. You may be lucky enough to have the talkative kids who are like, yeah, I'll share or whatever. But the opportunity to leverage that moment to have spiritual conversations, meaningful conversations in lieu of what you already know and the relationship that you're building isn't there. And the power of a small group, in my mind, is like that compound interest. It's every time you meet, you're building upon what you've already done in the past. And the more you get to know the student, the more trust they've built with you, the more things they've shared with you, the more things you share with them. It's like it just builds and builds and builds upon itself.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you may have a leader who's spent 2 or 3 or 4 years with a student in some small group settings, and they just know each other so well, and you've built such a strong relationship that the impact is so much deeper and so much stronger than it ever could be if there wasn't that relationship there.
Sure.
So to me, that's one of the keys is you've got to find leaders who have a heart to build relationship with students outside of your service, outside of even sometimes that small group gathering. Are they looking for moments and opportunities to build deep, meaningful relationships with the students that they've been entrusted?
Yeah, and the reality is, too, that takes longevity, that takes sacrifice, that takes a willingness to be like, hey, I recognize this is going to be a long-term journey. And maybe your small group season is a 8-week season, but the investment needs to be longer than that and bigger than that. And maybe programming wise, it's a certain number of weeks, and then you take a break, and then you get back together again. But if the care of that adult leader ends when the program ends, then, well, first of all, it'll be immediately smoked out as being phony care,
right?
But then you're missing that opportunity to continue to pace with and lead students towards health.
So one of the keys, and you basically said this, is longevity in your leadership. If you have high turnover in your leadership, it's going to be really hard to have effective small groups because kids, it takes time to build relationship with them.
Yeah, and chances are, if you've got a high turnover in your leadership too, there is a disconnect between those leaders and those students as well.
And you build the distrust.
Yeah.
They start to go like, And any youth pastor who's come in after a lot of transition in that youth group, it takes a long time when they're used to people leaving, they're used to turnover. It takes a long time to rebuild that trust back.
Yeah, and obviously there's all sorts of different reasons why leaders may come and go. We're talking about if this is a systemic issue with lots of leaders, lots of turnover, not like, oh, that leader left this year and then a couple of years later, a different leader comes in
right.
and goes.
So some wisdom in that would be protect your small groups make sure leaders are proving themselves to be faithful before you just plug them in as a small group leader and promise the world to these students. And then make sure that you're doing what you need to do to take care of your leaders and helping them be a part of a ministry that they want to be part of long term.
Jared, let me ask you a question related to this and leadership being part of the question. I'm curious your thoughts here. So say your leadership, your adult leadership staff is a certain size in which not every student can be a part of a small group and them still stay small groups, right? Like it can't be 20 kids in a small group or 15 kids in a small group. What would your suggestions be to the youth group that were like, I don't have enough leaders to have everybody be in a 5 to 7 person small group? How would you handle that situation from a leadership standpoint? Would you say it's better to just do what you can or wait until you can do it or try to make everyone work? What would your advice be?
Yeah, there? I would never say wait until you can, because my feeling is always start with what you have. And so for us, I would encourage you to get creative with it. My priority as far as students would be students that are typically going to be more consistent. So the ones that are basically faithful, available, teachable would maybe get priority if you have to make those decisions. So I wouldn't go out of my way to make sure the kid that only shows up once every 6 months to your back to school bash is like, well, we don't have a small group leader for him. It's like, well, okay, we'll build on that. So for me, that's what I would do. I would prioritize, get as many students connected to an adult leader in a small group setting that I can in a healthy and effective way. And then for me, my priority then became I need to recruit more adult leaders.
Yeah.
So for us, it was a 5-to-1 ratio. That's what we wanted to hit.
That's good.
Every leader had 5 students they were responsible for. And we weren't always at that ratio, but when we weren't, I mean, I knew my primary job, or one of my main jobs at that time, was I need to find great leaders to be a part of this ministry.
That's good. I think maybe then also, and I totally agree with everything you said there, and that actually maybe feeds this next idea, is that I think you can then begin to think creatively about what do your small groups look like, right? I think we have an idea of what a small group is or looks like, and it's, we go over to the youth leader's house and those 4 or 5 students or 6 students are gathered together. So if your group doesn't allow for that, or even if it does, I think it's good to also think creatively about your small groups, because the reality is if the small group is happening on a different night at a different time, depending on the season that the student is in, they may not be able to connect with that small group at that time or on multiple nights a week, some kind of thing. So one of the things that we considered, or one of the things that we did regularly in our youth group, is we would build in small group time, small group opportunities right into our large group gathering. So we met our youth group met for an hour and a half. I certainly did not need to preach at students for an hour or more. So and every week it didn't have to feel like that. So we would build in small groups, and I know lots of different youth groups do this. We weren't unique in that. So some models that groups would use is the pastor would introduce whatever the topic is. It would be your typical preaching in front of everybody for the first 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then they would break out into small groups to discuss what they had just heard. What we did in our youth group is each week kind of had a different feel to it, and the first week may be introduction of whatever the topic is, and then the next week we would break out in small groups. Now, of course, in that model, we would have to realize there may be students who were not there the week before, so we would facilitate that small group gathering right in the main room. We had a large enough space that we could gather in, and I could give whatever background information they had, and then the questions would be geared in such a way that if you didn't have a whole lot of background knowledge in whatever we were talking, you could still respond to whatever was happening based on your own personal experiences, your personal thoughts related to the topic, things like that. And so we were able to create those small group conversations, relational, struggle, respond. What do you think? This is what the youth leader is saying. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Right within that same space. And so it provided some small group opportunity without necessarily having to have enough leaders for every student then would be able to participate that was there on that Wednesday night.
Yeah, I love that. And you talked about that in our video that we created, which is the idea of kind of get creative with your small group environments when you need to. And I think that's important and that's valuable because everybody's context is different. Everybody's ministry ability and setting is different. And so I remember one time we did our small groups on Sunday mornings. It was at a larger church. We had 3 services, so it worked well where parents could come and go to one service and their kids could come to one of the small groups and one of the other services. And so and it was awesome because our leaders were already there. So what we would tell our leaders is come attend one service, and then the next service you're doing our small groups. And so it worked well for us. It may not work for you, but think through creatively. How do I create these small group environments in a way that works? And then how do I continue to recruit more leaders so we can reach more students? So yeah, I think that's awesome. Now, Mark, I'm interested to hear your perspective. Anybody that has done small groups knows it's very easy to have one person who can ruin an entire small group, right? Maybe it's that one student who just doesn't shut up. They keep talking, or they say inappropriate things, or whatever it is. Like it's if you don't have the right leader to manage that, or one student can totally derail a small group. I know for you, a big part of what you did in your training of leaders was to address this. So share with us a little bit about kind of your experience in that.
Yeah, sure. And this is probably something that I think we've talked about fleshing out even more so in a future episode or a future, because I think you could spend a lot of time taking a look at some different personalities of students and say, okay, how would you address them? How do you still love and care for them? Because these particular personality types are kind of the disruptive personality types. Now, there's lots of great personality types within your youth group, within your small groups as well. But I'm just going to run through these names really quickly, and then we could talk about them really briefly on this particular podcast, and then flesh them out more a little bit later. So one of the things we identified was that there are the terms are pretty self-explanatory, but there's the Dominators. Those are the ones that kind of take over the whole small group. Yep. There's the Hiders, those that are there in the small group, but they try to hide and disappear from answering any questions, or like almost make it like they're not there even though they are there. There's the Scoffer, who's kind of like makes fun of everything and everything is stupid, and they're just like, ugh, whatever. There's the Revealers, the ones that overshare, maybe a little too personal, or maybe they don't overshare something too personal. Maybe they just are way too detailed in what it is that they're sharing. Like, we don't need to know all of it. We just wanted this little idea. And then the last one was the problem solver, and that's the student who's probably well intentioned, but they're like, as a student is sharing something deep that's happened to them, they're like, oh, well, I know how you can fix that.
Yeah, they can fix everybody.
It's maybe a little emotionally stunted in empathizing with someone else. But if as a leader, if you're not aware that those personalities are there, they can derail a small group pretty quickly. Making sure, and so that's where having some ground rules within your small group is really important. Making sure everyone has a chance to share. One little trick that we would employ with our leaders in leading their small group would be, not every question has to be an open question to the entire group. Right? You can direct questions to individual students. So if the Dominator, the Dominator is going to get their word in, right? And the problem solver at some point is probably going to get their word in as well.
This is a true story, though. And this was when I was doing college ministry, but we had a Dominator in our group. And my wife and I would pull her aside outside of the group because it was so bad. And we would say to her, listen, you're allowed to talk one time, and here's what you're going to do. When you feel like you have something to say, have a piece of paper, write it down, and then you can hold on to that. Because for her, it was like, if I don't get this out, I'm going to forget it. And it's, so we would have conversations with them outside because it was
Sure.
if you're not, like you said, if you're not on top of it, it can get so bad.
Yeah, and that's a good teachable moment too, Jared, because typically that mentality of, oh man, I got to get this out, I'm going to forget it, or it's usually because they have missed the intention of that group of people sharing and talking together, and they've made it about me pontificating or sharing my thoughts, or my words are more valuable. And they've missed, hey, hearing from the other people is just as valuable as my contribution to the group as well. So it's a cool teachable moment to say, you've got some great things to share. Recognize that hearing from your teammate, your small group members, is just as valuable. And so being able to know how to navigate that, how to not sidestep their contribution, but know how to manage their contribution will be really, really helpful. Another way so for the opposite one is the hider, right? Another thing that we would talk about in our group or with my leaders would be, it's okay even within a small group to get even smaller. So to almost warm them up to talking to the group, we would, within our small group, we would then pair off people to talk about something for a minute. Because sometimes for them, just talking to one person is less intimidating than talking to the whole group at large. And then what we would do is I would intentionally pair them off at some point with everybody in the group. So they've almost warmed up to everyone in the group. So then it becomes more comfortable to talk to the whole group because I've already kind of broke that ice a little bit with the group over time, of course.
I love that. One of the things we would do as well is just a little, instead of just saying, does anybody have any thoughts? I would say, you know what? We're going to go around at each one of us. I want to hear from each one of you on your thought on this.
Yeah.
So it gave everybody a chance to share, but the person who was a hider who maybe didn't want to share, but now they kind of have to and it's good for them, or maybe they really wanted to share, but they're never going to assert themselves, but given the opportunity, they would. So that's one thing that we would do. And it also helps keep in check the dominators and the people that would comment time after time. It's like, you get one chance and then we're moving on.
Yeah, and I think, again, that falls to the leader, knowing how to ask questions, what type of questions to ask. I mean, nothing short circuits a small group discussion more than a leader who's just asking yes or no questions, and the person can just be like, yeah, I agree, yeah. Yes or no. It hasn't. That hasn't been the case.
Right.
So knowing how to ask questions, and then open-ended questions, and then knowing how to follow up. Like I never would take the quick yes or no answer as the full answer. I'd be like, unpack that a little bit more. Explain that to me. What are you thinking when you say that?
Right.
It just to continue to facilitate that question a little bit more. So avoid the yes or no type questions.
Yeah, I love that. So what would you do, Mark, in because if someone's listening to this and they're like, that's great, I love that, it's awesome ideas, how do I get my leaders there? What did it look like for you guys? Did you have a training process? Did a leader observe before they got to participate? Did you have a system in place to make this happen, or was it more just kind of organic?
So we did do a lot of intentional training of what does a small group look like? How to lead and facilitate a small group? Anybody who was a new leader, if we had to have individuals, singular leaders lead groups. If you were new, you never led a group by yourself without being a part of a small group with another leader, so you could kind of see what was happening. And then really just helping the leader to understand how it connects to the bigger picture. We're not just putting something else on the calendar that you poor leaders who already give so much time to has to do something else. And so quite honestly, it was small groups were an outflow of the care that was already invested in those students within the group. So that was where we say this a lot in our different podcasts or in our different messages. That's where the why makes the what really easy, or it makes it easier anyways, because it's still a great deal of sacrifice for a leader to be like, okay, here's another night of doing something. And then, and maybe I erred too much on the side of not pushing to get them on the calendar. I think that got me in trouble a lot of times as far as like, this was just a busy season, so we didn't do it. And one season turns into 2 seasons of not doing it and some longer stretches. But recognizing this is going to be an investment, but But again, having a set timeline to be like, hey, this is going to be an 8-week one, so that our leaders can be like, okay, I can get my head wrapped around 8 weeks and then I'll get a break. But that doesn't mean that I stop caring for those students. That just means the extra programming of the small group is not every week for eternity. And some leaders have that margin and are able to do that, and that's great if you can do that. But if you're going to start somewhere, be like, hey, let's handle a bite-sized piece of this, get the value that we need to out of it, and then continue to march forward.
And doing your small group on, if you only have one night available, do your small groups on that night. And, we would do that same thing where we would say, okay, your responsibility as a leader is you're expected to hang out with students outside of our meeting times, but we're not going to expect you to have a whole nother night where it's just small groups. So we'll incorporate that into our one meeting gathering. So I think that's important. It matters for sure. I did want to say one of the things that we would do to help train our leaders is I would encourage leaders to do this is. I would actually go around and take the opportunity to sit in on different small groups and just listen and try to be a part. And the reason I did it for 2 reasons. Number one was to help coach them a little bit. So because some of them were still learning, and I would just take the opportunity to help observe, and then hey, here's how you could handle that student, or I would even take the lead a little bit in the small group when I sat down. But the other reason I would do it is for accountability, because different leaders also have different maturity levels, and one of the things that will happen with leaders is some of the leaders don't understand the boundaries between being friends and hanging out and having spiritual conversations. And so they interpret none of these kids want to have spiritual conversations, so they'll spend the 25 minutes just talking about football or whatever.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know that, because I want to be able to say to these guys, listen, you may have to do a little work here to get them, but that's your job. Like, we don't want to spend 20 minutes talking about football. Not that that's not great at times, but this is a moment for us to talk about this kind of stuff, and you've got to help get your kids there. So for me, that was a benefit.
And it implies something to those students that either, I don't have to be taken seriously if they may interpret it that, or we don't have a deep relationship. It's kind of a superficial, topical sort of relationship. Right. And so, it may be awkward at first, and it may feel forced. And this is another thing that I encouraged all of my leaders: be okay with the uncomfortable silence when you ask a question. Yeah. Don't be so quick to rescue the group and re-ask the question, or I'll go first.
So what do you guys think? Nobody? Okay. Exactly.
So be okay with just letting it sit and simmer. Well, first of all, I know even for myself, I got to sit and think and process. As the leader, you may have thought of the question for the last 2 days. The students are just hearing it for the first time. So it may take some time for them to sit and think and process. And in fact, you may even be able to build that into the way you present the question. Hey, take 30 seconds here. I want you to think about this, and then I want to hear from some of you guys. Yeah. So you almost build in the uncomfortable
or pick the
silence.
Student that will be able to jump right off and say, hey, we're going to have Johnny go first, and then we're going to go around, each one of you are going to go or whatever. So it gives them a little prep time. But that's
okay.
Great.
And even if you've already gotten responses from 2 or 3 students, be okay still with letting a little bit of time linger in hopes that some of the hiders or some of those other students would be willing to share. And eventually, if they're like, he's not going to move on until we give an answer, then I'll respond to it and keep things moving along. Yeah. Now, obviously, there's a point in which you're like, it's ridiculous. And you're like, I'm just going to sit here until you guys answer. Right. We're not going to move on until you do. Like, that's not the intention. But be okay with the uncomfortable silence.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the end of time here, but one of the other thoughts that I had is, and we've touched on this, but I want to just kind of reword it and reshape it, is the idea that you have to create connection points, relationship building points outside of that small group environment from your leaders, and so think through all the different environments you have and where does small groups fall into that? Yeah. And how do I leverage and create relationships that are happening all throughout the time so that when those small group moments come, they're really powerful.
Yeah, and you might even find that there's already some built-in groups that already exist that may not function specifically as small groups, but could so easily. So in a previous podcast, we talked about having a hospitality team. Well, those students and adult leaders that are part of that team, that's almost a built-in small group right there. If you have a youth worship team, you've got a built-in small group right there. You know, if you've got a missions team or a serve team of some sort. All of those things, man, those are great opportunities to be like, hey, we're already shoulder to shoulder living life here. This is a built-in small group. Let's continue with the relationships these adult leaders and students have to go even deeper.
Yeah, and create a system that will help your leaders be able to do that and stay in touch and build relationship. Like for us, we would do a thing called we pray every day. So here's what the expectation was: you pray every day for your 5 students that you had. Connect once a week. That was via text, phone call, Facebook message, whatever the vehicle was, and then hang out once a month outside of a youth group gathering. That's what their expectation was. We were convinced if they did that, they would build a relationship with their kids.
Not only that, too, Jared, and I think that's so good. I wish I could hit the rewind button. I didn't state it like that, but we had at least the similar idea or feel to it. But the reality is, if you're not willing to invest that minimum, like,
don't be a youth leader.
Yeah, there's probably some other reason. There's something else you can do better with your time.
Go be on the adult worship team,
right?
No, I'm just kidding.
But I think that's pretty. I mean, that's a pretty minimum expectation, and yet a very powerful one.
Yep.
So I don't think it's overreaching for any adult leader to be able to Can you say that again? To be able to commit to those things.
Pray every day.
Yeah.
Connect once a week.
It's good.
Hang out once a month.
Now that assumes that the adult leader is actually praying every day in their own life.
Well, that's the double-edged sword. It helps them actually develop their own prayer life.
There you go.
Which is good. So, hey guys, thanks so much for listening. We hope this was a benefit to you. We hope you continue to work towards creating great small groups. This is Better Student Ministry Podcast.
Thanks so much for listening.
Peace.
Thanks so much for listening to the Better Student Ministry Podcast. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to check out our 10-minute training videos and discussion guide for you and your team. You can find those on YouTube and Facebook by searching Better Student Ministry. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what topics you would like covered. You can also email us at betterstudentministry@gmail.com.